Hello everyone. So I'm making this video to discuss the idea of making the right mistakes. Now, I know it sounds funny because there is this idea that one wants to avoid mistakes and mistakes are something bad, something to avoid, etc., etc. But in reality, of course, mistakes are easy to recognize in hindsight, but not necessarily before the fact. So the idea of the only way not to make mistakes is not to do anything. So it kind of makes no sense to try to avoid mistakes. I mean, of course, it's better to be careful than to be careless, but most mistakes are probably errors in terms of strategy or some decision or etc., etc. So what does it mean to make the right mistakes? Well, because you cannot avoid the mistakes, because it's impossible to avoid them before the fact, often you can only recognize them after the fact, or if not, you will just not have done it if you could have recognized it before. The idea is rather than focusing on something impossible, which is avoiding mistakes, we focus on something possible, which is trying to do the right mistakes. So what are the right mistakes? Well, there is a saying that says that in order to gain experience, you have to make mistakes, which I guess is true. But then you also want to be able to leverage those mistakes as experience to then do something. So you have to be very careful of which mistakes you make, because some mistakes will generate valuable experience and other mistakes may also generate valuable experience but may generate a lot of side effects. So when you decide what decision to make, you should of course be aware that there is a high chance that this will be a mistake, because I mean, you know, historically that a lot of decisions you make will lead to mistakes. So you know already that whatever decision you make, there is a high chance that it becomes a mistake. So, but you cannot avoid the mistake, because the only way to avoid the mistake will be to not do any decision. So how can you choose specific categories or groups of decisions where, if it turns out to be a mistake, which is very likely because most decisions will be a mistake, then the mistake will be useful. It will be something that you can gain experience from, and it wouldn't have too many side effects. So let's make a stupid example, but I think it really gives the point. So let's say that you want to make some money. So you may decide, and you think, maybe I found a trick to win at the casino. You go to the casino, you play the roulette, you lose your money. If you're young and you lose a relatively small amount of money, it's not a big deal. I mean, you made a mistake, you gained some experience, probably you understood that it doesn't make sense to play the roulette. It's a stupid game. But now let's say that, on the other hand, you want to make money and you say, maybe I will rob a bank, or maybe I will go to Colombia and buy some cocaine and bring it somewhere. Well, that may not be the right mistake to make, because the consequence may be very severe. Yes, you will probably gain the experience that it's a stupid idea, but then you may get 20 years in jail. So how exactly are you going to use that experience for your next decisions if you're in jail for 20 years? Probably you cannot. So that would be the wrong kind of mistake. The mistake that leads you to going 20 years in jail is probably the wrong kind of mistake. The right kind of mistake is a mistake where the loss is not much in terms of time, in terms of money, in terms of reputation, etc., etc., etc. So in general, it can actually be useful to attempt many things, try many things, what they call fail quickly. So, but I think the point I want to add with this idea of make the right mistake is, when you make a decision, assume already that there is a very high chance that the outcome will be bad, that basically it will be a mistake. Things will not go the way you want. Things will go wrong. And under this perspective, the perspective that most likely it will not go right, most likely it will go wrong, most likely it will not go as you plan, try to understand how much experience you're likely to accumulate through this mistake. Of course, it's hard to estimate, but still, you can get an idea how much experience you're going to accumulate in that. But also, what are the other associated costs with it? So is there a certain risk of going to jail? Is there a certain risk of getting hurt? Is there a certain risk of like losing a significant amount of money? Is there a risk of losing a certain amount of time? Is there a risk in losing certain relationships that could be important? Is there a risk in terms of reputation? So if the idea is to see a decision as an experiment. So an experiment is the idea that it's a small decision which is limited in scope. So let's say when they were researching the nuclear bomb, it's not that they immediately start by bombing a city. They do different experiments. So maybe they start with small explosions on a small scale, then they try larger explosions on a larger scale, but in like desertic areas where there is nobody, and in a very controlled environment. So knowing that there is a high chance for things to go wrong, you try to minimize the negative impact. So you carefully, it's really the idea, I mean, the idea of doing the right mistakes is similar to imagining all decisions as experiments. So to say, okay, so instead of saying this is my decision, it's kind of saying this is my decision / experiment. This is my experiment. I'm going to run this experiment. So since it's an experiment, because there is a very high chance that things don't go the way we expect, how do we minimize the damage? So I kind of invite, if one is interested, people that are listening to this video, to imagine their decisions as experiments so that they can correctly think which ones are the, let's say, risks worth taking, risks not worth taking, mistake worth making, mistake not worth making. So the right mistakes are the mistakes that are worth making. So it's worth trying the experiment because there is a high potential for, well, we may be right, we may gain experience, and the downside, the associated cost with the mistake is not too high. So for example, starting immediately by doing crime is probably a bad idea because the cost could be very high very early on. So you may be 18, you have just turned 18, you start to do crimes, you may very quickly get very long jail sentences, and so you cannot really recover from that mistake. So you cannot see it as an experiment. You cannot say, I'm going to experiment with crime. It doesn't make sense. So crime is more, you're going all in to some extent. It's not really an experiment. If it goes wrong, it goes wrong, and basically it's over. But there are many cases where you can instead see it as experiments. You can say, okay, I want to start this business. So maybe you start with a low cost. Maybe you started only online with a few units and you try to see very quickly if it works or not. Any opportunity you have to validate something to ensure, any opportunity you have basically to say that if it turned out to be a mistake, it's not so bad. If it turns out that you were wrong, it's not so bad. So in some way, it's not really about making mistakes. It's really about deciding in advance if something is a risk worth taking, knowing that there is a very high chance that it will be a mistake. And if it will be a mistake, you still want it to benefit you if possible. So how much experience are you going to gain if it turns out to be a mistake? If you gain very little experience and the associated costs are very high, probably it's a bad idea. It's not something, you should not take the chance because it could be a mistake. And if it turns out to be a mistake, it's very bad. So you want to take those mistakes that if it turns out that they're a mistake, it's not that bad. And ideally, this is something you want to do as early as possible in life because, assuming we are talking about small mistakes and small risks, so mistakes that you can easily recover from, those should be taken early on in life. Whereas once you reach a certain age, let's say when you're maybe 40 or 50, if you do certain mistakes, it may be a lot more difficult to recover from. Let's say, for example, getting fired at 25 is not the same as getting fired at 50. So at 25, you can clearly take more risks. So certain mistakes that you do at 25 could be the right mistakes, but they could be the wrong mistakes when you're 50. So it's important to notice how easy it is to recover from the mistake. You want to do a lot of the mistakes that you can easily recover from because those they will give you experience without a high associated cost. but you don't want to do mistake that is where it's difficult to recover from, that are non-reversible. If it's very difficult to reverse the mistake, it can be very dangerous. Like if you end up going to jail for many years, this is not reversible. So it's a very, very dangerous mistake to make. So you should avoid the kind of decision that can lead to this mistake. But mistakes that are where the loss is small, easily reversible, especially if you take those mistakes, if you make those mistakes early on in your life, they can lead to a lot of experience being developed. And this experience may be useful in the future to try to do even better mistakes or even better experiments. And at some point, some of those decisions could very well turn out to be correct and not be a mistake. But that could be in part or mostly because of the experience you acquired from the previous mistake. So in order to make a very, very good decision, you probably have to acquire a certain amount of experience. And to acquire this experience, you have to make a lot of mistakes. So the key is not in not making the mistake. The key is in understanding that in order to acquire the experience that will lead you to the very good decisions, you have to make a lot of mistakes. So you have to be sure that those are the right mistakes. Small in the loss, easily reversible, ideally taken early on in your life, and that they have a high potential for generating experience.